Last night I heard noises out in the yard. This morning I checked the security footage only to realize that the files were completely gone. Wiped clean. So I took the camera to the local tech shop to get it checked. The technician, a kid who usually doesn't look up from his screen, suddenly stared at me. He looked absolutely terrified. "Sir, you need to leave. Right now," he said. I stepped closer to the monitor, and what I saw made my blood run cold. My name is Richard Lawson. I am 70 years old, a retired structural engineer and a widower. 5 years ago, I lost my Patricia. The silence in this house since she left has been a heavy thing. A few months back, my son Derek and his wife Monica moved in. They said they were here to help care for me after I had a slight spike in my blood pressure. Monica is a home care nurse. She said it was the perfect arrangement. They could save for a house and I would get the care I needed. I thought it was a blessing. I really did. I was standing in the back of Toby's tech shop, holding my breath. Toby is a sharp kid, good with data recovery. I handed him the camera, hoping it was just a glitch, maybe some raccoons knocking over the bins. But Toby managed to pull the deleted files. He hit play, and the grainy black and white night vision flickered on the screen. The timestamp read 2:04 a.m. There was Derek, my son. And right beside him was Monica. They were standing by the back gate, peering out into the alleyway. Derek raised a hand, motioning someone forward. Two massive men stepped into the frame. They weren't carrying groceries or moving boxes. They were hauling heavy, industrial-looking metallic crates. They moved with purpose, bypassing the kitchen door entirely. They headed straight down the external stairwell into my basement. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. Why was my son sneaking heavy crates into my house in the middle of the night? I leaned in, squinting at the screen. The men's faces were partially obscured, but as one of them turned toward the camera for a split second, the street lamp caught his profile. Toby gasped. He practically threw himself backward, his chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. He slammed the laptop shut. "Sir," he said, his voice shaking. "Sir, you need to take this and leave, now." "What's wrong, Toby? Who was that?" I asked, my heart starting to pound a steady rhythm against my ribs. Toby swallowed hard, looking around the empty shop as if someone was watching us. "Mr. Lawson, that guy, the one with the scar on his jaw. That's Marcus the Anvil Sterling. He's not a delivery guy. He's a loan shark, a really, really bad one. He operates out of Fairfax, the kind of guy who doesn't ask twice for his money. People end up in the hospital or worse when they owe him." The room spun. My son Derek was bringing a violent criminal into my home. Into the house Patricia and I had built, Toby shoved the camera into my hands. "Don't tell anyone you were here, please. I don't want any trouble." I walked out of that shop in a daze. The drive back to my house in Fairfax County felt like a blur. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the impossible. Derek had a good job in finance. At least that's what he told me. Why would he be dealing with a loan shark, and what was in those crates? I pulled into the driveway. The house looked exactly as it always did. A sturdy brick colonial, a safe place. I parked my car, took a deep breath, and walked through the front door. The smell of brewing coffee hit me. Everything was infuriatingly normal. Monica was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she wiped down the counter. She looked up and flashed that perfect, bright smile of hers. "Morning, Dad. You were up early. I didn't even hear you leave." I forced my facial muscles to relax. I couldn't let them know what I had seen. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly what was happening. "Just went for a drive," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Couldn't sleep. Speaking of which, did you guys hear anything strange last night? Sounded like some noise out by the back gate." Monica didn't even miss a beat. Her smile didn't falter. Her eyes didn't dart away. She just poured a cup of coffee and slid it across the island toward me. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Dad," she said smoothly. "Derek was just helping a friend. His buddy is opening a new private clinic across town, and they needed a place to store some surplus medical equipment for a few days while the lease gets sorted. We thought the basement would be perfect. We tried to be as quiet as possible. We really didn't want to wake you. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. A logical answer delivered with absolute calm. If I hadn't seen Toby's terrified face, if I hadn't heard the name Marcus Sterling, I would have believed her instantly. Medical equipment, I repeated slowly, taking a sip of the coffee. Yes, she said, pulling a small plastic pill organizer from the cabinet. Just some monitors and exam tables. Nothing to worry about. Here, take your morning pills, Dad. Your blood pressure has been so erratic lately. You need to stay on top of your medication. She handed me 3 small white pills and a glass of water. Her eyes were full of genuine concern. The perfect, caring daughter-in-law. But as a structural engineer, I spent my life looking for cracks in the foundation. And right now, my gut was screaming that the entire structure of this house was about to collapse. I took the pills, raised the glass to my lips, and pretended to swallow. As soon as she turned around to check the stove, I slipped the pills into my palm and slid them into my pocket. Thanks, sweetheart, I said. I think I'll go rest for a bit. I walked upstairs, the weight of those tiny pills heavy in my pocket, knowing that the real nightmare was only just beginning. Once inside my bedroom, I quietly pushed the brass lock into place. My hands were trembling, but not from the phantom age-related weakness they had convinced me was my new reality. It was pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I walked over to the mahogany desk by the window, the same desk where I had drafted hundreds of blueprints over my 40-year career, and carefully unrolled the damp napkin. There they were, 3 small, chalky white pills. I turned on my reading lamp and pulled my reading glasses from my breast pocket. For the past 3 months, Monica had been handing me my daily medication in a little plastic cup. She was a registered home care nurse, and I was a grieving widower with a slight spike in blood pressure. I had trusted her implicitly. I had trusted my son. Why wouldn't I? They had packed up their apartment and moved into my house specifically to take care of me. That was the story anyway. The narrative they sold to me, to the neighbors, and to our extended family. I squinted at the pills under the harsh yellow light. My prescribed blood pressure medication was a distinct pinkish-red oval with specific alphanumeric engravings. These pills were perfectly round, stark white, and bore a tiny, unfamiliar imprint. I had no idea what they were, but a cold, heavy pit formed in my stomach as the realization washed over me. Monica was not treating my blood pressure. She was dosing me. I did not throw the pills away. An engineer never discards an anomaly. He catalogs it. I walked over to my closet, reached up to the top shelf, and grabbed an old heavy-duty flashlight I hadn't used in years. I unscrewed the base, removed the dead batteries, dropped the 3 pills inside, and screwed it back together. I placed it back on the shelf, hidden in plain sight. That flashlight would become my daily repository. Every morning and every evening, I would take the plastic cup from Monica, with a grateful smile, pretend to swallow the contents with a swig of water, and then excuse myself to the bathroom or my bedroom to spit them out. The first 24 hours were agonizing. My body had apparently grown dependent on whatever chemical cocktail she was feeding me. I experienced vicious cold sweats, a pounding headache that felt like a vice grip tightening around my temples, and a deep aching nausea. That evening at dinner, I barely touched the roast chicken Monica had prepared. Derek looked at me across the dining table, his face a mask of practiced concern. "You look pale, Dad. Are you feeling all right? You've been staring at your plate for 10 minutes. I forced a weak, wavering smile, leaning into the role of the frail old man they desperately wanted me to be. "Just a bit tired, Derek. The years are catching up with me, I suppose. My head feels a little cloudy." Monica reached over and patted my hand gently. Her touch, which I once found comforting, now felt like the brush of a venomous snake. "It's just the natural progression of things, Dad. Your body is slowing down. That's why we are here. To make sure you don't overexert yourself. You just need to rest and let the medication do its work." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes downcast to hide the sharp, burning anger I knew must be flickering in them. "You're right, sweetheart. I think I will just go lie down." By the morning of the third day, the withdrawal symptoms had faded. But something much more profound occurred. The thick, suffocating mental fog that had blanketed my mind for the past 3 months began to lift. It was like watching a heavy storm cloud dissipate to reveal a clear, sharp sky. For weeks, I had struggled to remember simple words. I had misplaced my keys, forgotten appointments, and felt a constant dragging lethargy that kept me confined to my leather armchair in the living room. I had truly believed my mind was decaying. I had mourned the loss of my own intellect, but as the chemicals completely drained from my bloodstream, my cognitive faculties snapped back into place. My thoughts were no longer wading through molasses. They were rapid, precise, and analytical. My hands, which had trembled so badly I could barely hold a coffee mug, were now perfectly steady. I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The tired, confused old man they had manufactured was gone. The structural engineer was back. The clarity brought an overwhelming wave of horror. They were chemically restraining me. They were artificially inducing dementia. My own son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the man whose college tuition I had paid in full, was actively participating in the systematic erasure of my mind. But why? The answer lay in this basement. It had to. The 2 massive crates hauled in by a notorious loan shark at 2 a.m. were the key to this entire nightmare. They needed me docile, confused, and confined to the upper floors, so I would not ask questions, wander around at night, or notice the illicit traffic moving through my own backyard. I sat on the edge of my bed, my mind working through the variables like a complex mathematical equation. My initial instinct, the hot-blooded reaction of a betrayed father, was to march downstairs, confront them, and demand they leave my house immediately. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake Derek and ask him how he could do this to the man who raised him. I wanted to call the police and have them both dragged out in handcuffs. But logic quickly suppressed the emotion. If I called the authorities right now, what would happen? The police would arrive. Derek and Monica would act like the concerned, loving caregivers. They would point to the fact that I had been acting erratically for months. Monica, a licensed medical professional, would testify that I was suffering from paranoia and early-onset dementia. They would tell the officers that I was hallucinating about loan sharks and secret crates. And if the police ordered a blood test, they might still find traces of whatever sedatives she had been feeding me, which would only support their claim that I was confused and unwell. Worse yet, if the police did search the basement and found nothing, because I had no idea what was actually in those crates, or if they had already moved the contents, I would look completely insane. It would give Derek the perfect legal ammunition to declare me a danger to myself and seek a forced psychiatric evaluation. I would be walking directly into a trap. No, a confrontation without irrefutable proof was a losing strategy. I was dealing with a calculating enemy who had already infiltrated my defenses. I had to operate in the shadows, just like they did. I had to let them believe they were winning. I had to let them think the drugs were still working, that my mind was still crumbling, that I was nothing more than a helpless, clueless burden. I spent the rest of that afternoon observing them with fresh eyes. Now that the fog was gone, the subtle, terrifying details of their deception became glaringly obvious. I noticed how Derek would quickly lock his laptop screen whenever I shuffled into the living room. I noticed the micro-expressions of annoyance that flickered across Monica's face when I asked her to repeat a sentence. I noticed how they positioned themselves between me and the hallway leading to the basement stairs, a subconscious physical barricade. They were managing me. I was not a father to them. I was an obstacle they were carefully navigating around. That evening, I sat in my armchair holding a newspaper upside down, letting my eyes glaze over. Derek walked past me, a stack of manila folders under his arm. He didn't even look at me. He just kept walking toward the basement door. I listened intently. I heard the sharp electronic beep of a keypad. My brow furrowed. There had never been an electronic lock on the basement door. It was a standard brass deadbolt. When did they change the lock? And why? I waited until I heard the heavy thud of the door closing behind him. I slowly folded the newspaper, placed it on the coffee table, and stood up. The stiffness in my joints was gone, replaced by a quiet, simmering energy. The lie they had spun was perfectly constructed, a seamless web of fake compassion and medical manipulation. But they had made one fatal error. They had forgotten who built this house. They had forgotten that before I was a grieving widower, I was a man who designed structures meant to withstand immense pressure. I wasn't going to break. I was going to pull their entire operation apart brick by brick. But to do that, I needed to know exactly what they were hiding down there. I needed to breach the basement, and I had to do it without them ever knowing I had stepped foot inside. The game had changed. I was no longer the victim. I was the architect of their downfall. The next 3 days required the greatest performance of my entire life. I woke up each morning, shuffled into the kitchen, with a practiced stoop in my shoulders, and greeted my son and his wife with the vacant, docile smile they had come to expect. Monica would hand me the little plastic cup containing the 3 white pills. I would thank her, place them on my tongue, take a generous swallow of orange juice, and walk back to the master bathroom. There, I would spit the damp pills into a tissue, flush the toilet for sound cover, and deposit the toxic evidence into the hidden flashlight on my closet shelf. The physical toll of the sudden withdrawal was grueling, but I endured it in silence. On the first day, my hands shook with a violent, uncontrollable tremor that I barely had to fake during dinner. My skin felt clammy and a persistent dull ache throbbed behind my eyes. Derek noticed my lack of appetite, commenting with feigned sympathy that I looked like I was deteriorating. Monica simply patted my shoulder, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, assuring him that my body was just adjusting to the natural decline of old age. I nodded, playing the part of the fading patriarch, while a fierce, cold determination solidified in my chest. By the second day, the nausea began to recede, replaced by an intense, ravenous hunger that I had to suppress whenever they were in the room. I sneaked granola bars and apples into my study during the night, eating in the dark while listening to the faint, muffled sounds of them moving around downstairs. I was surviving in the shadows of my home. Came the morning of the 3rd day. I opened my eyes, and for the first time in over 3 months, the world did not look like it was submerged in murky water. The heavy, suffocating blanket of confusion that had pressed down on my thoughts was entirely gone. I sat up on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands. I held them out in front of me, fingers spread wide. They were perfectly still, not a single tremor, not a hint of weakness. I closed my eyes and began to run through mental exercises I used to perform during my engineering days. I calculated the weight distribution of steel beams. I recited the square roots of complex numbers. I visualized the exact blueprints of my home, tracing every electrical wire and plumbing pipe from the attic down to the foundation. My mind was not just functional. It was incredibly sharp, firing on all cylinders, processing information with a speed and precision that made my pulse race with triumphant validation. I was not suffering from any early dementia. I was not succumbing to the ravages of time. The terrifying memory lapses, the inability to recall simple words, the profound exhaustion that kept me chained to my armchair. None of it was real. It was all a chemically manufactured illusion. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Monica was a registered nurse. She had the medical knowledge, the access to pharmaceuticals, and the deceptive charm required to pull this off without raising a single red flag. She had been systematically poisoning me, calibrating the dosage perfectly to keep me compliant, confused, and entirely dependent on them. They had hijacked my autonomy, turning my own body into a biological prison. I thought about the sheer malice required to watch a father slowly lose his mind, knowing you were the one pouring the poison into his cup every single morning. Derek, my own flesh and blood, had sat across from me at the dinner table, watching my hands shake, watching me struggle to articulate a sentence, and he had smiled. He had played the role of the devoted, worried son for the neighbors, while actively facilitating my cognitive destruction. I walked over to the window and looked out at the manicured lawn. I was a hostage in the sanctuary I had built with my late wife. Every locked door, every changed password, every canceled credit card. It was a meticulously designed cage. They had severed my connections to the outside world, ensuring that if I ever tried to cry for help, I would be dismissed as a tragic, delusional old man, suffering from a deteriorating mind. The sheer brilliance of their cruelty was terrifying. They did not need to use physical force to subdue me. They simply altered my chemistry, making me a prisoner, trapped inside a failing brain, unable to trust my own memories or perceptions. But they had miscalculated. They assumed that my silence was a symptom of their success. They did not realize that beneath the frail exterior, they had forced upon me the architect of this house was wide awake and actively assessing structural weaknesses. My clarity brought a dangerous, burning focus. I knew I could not simply confront them. Confrontation required leverage, and right now all I had were suspicions and a collection of white pills hidden in a flashlight. If I demanded answers, Monica would simply adjust the narrative. She would claim I was having a paranoid episode, a common symptom of severe cognitive decline. Derek would use that outburst to justify a legal intervention, rushing me into a psychiatric hold before I could ever reach a lawyer or the police. I needed irrefutable proof, and the key to dismantling their entire operation lay beneath my feet. I stared at the floorboards, imagining the space below. The basement. That was the epicenter of their secret. The two muscular men, the notorious loan shark, the heavy metallic crates hauled in through the back gate under the cover of darkness. Whatever they were hiding down there was the reason for my chemical imprisonment. They needed me sedated and oblivious so they could use my property as a staging ground for something highly illegal. I had to know what was in those crates. I had to breach the basement. But the old brass deadbolt had been replaced with a complex biometric keypad lock. I had casually tested the handle the day before, finding it unyielding and cold. I could not simply wander downstairs anymore. I needed to bypass their security, infiltrate my own home, and document the truth without leaving a single trace. I needed a plan that utilized the one advantage I possessed. I knew the bones of this house better than anyone on earth. I closed the blinds and stepped into my bedroom. The silence of the house pressed against the walls, but I no longer felt trapped by it. I felt empowered. Every creak of the floorboards, every hidden space, every ventilation shaft was a pathway only I completely understood. They had locked the front door, but they had absolutely no idea about the structural secrets hidden behind the drywall. I was going to construct a countermeasure so precise and so devastating that they would never see it coming. My name is Richard Thomas Lawson. They wanted an old, helpless victim, but what they were about to get was a master engineer ready for a total war right now. The opportunity arrived the next morning. Monica announced at breakfast they needed to do a grocery run. She handed me my plastic cup of pills with her usual sweet smile. I executed my routine flawlessly. I placed the tablets on my tongue, took a gulp of water, and smiled back. As soon as I heard Derek's car pull into the street, I went straight to the bathroom, spat the pills into a tissue, and deposited them into the hollow flashlight. My mind was clear now. The chemical fog was a distant memory. I walked downstairs, my footsteps silent on the hardwood floors. I headed straight for the hallway that led to the basement stairs. The door was tucked away near the laundry room, usually secured by a simple brass deadbolt. I had installed that deadbolt myself 30 years ago. I reached out to grab the handle, but my hand stopped in midair. The brass deadbolt was gone. In its place sat a sleek biometric keypad. A small red light pulsed rhythmically at the top. I leaned in, inspecting the installation. It was a high-end commercial model, the kind of hardware you expect to see on a bank vault, not on a residential basement door. Derek had meticulously removed my old lock, filled the strike plate, and mounted a fortress-level security device inside my home. As an engineer, I appreciated the flawless installation, but as a father, I felt a fresh wave of nausea. This lock required a thumbprint and a passcode. I could not pick it. I could not pry it open without triggering an internal alarm or leaving massive damage on the doorframe. They had sealed off the entire lower level. Whatever was inside those heavy crates was completely inaccessible to me. I stared at the flashing red light. They were arrogant but careful. If I tampered with this door, they would know instantly. I needed another angle. I retreated to the kitchen. My heart was beating a steady rhythm. If they were this careful about the basement, they had to be hiding other things in plain sight. People who lie constantly always make mistakes. They get comfortable. They get sloppy. I started opening drawers, sifting through the mail pile on the counter, checking the inside of the pantry. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Bills, catalogs, a few grocery receipts. I moved to the tall stainless steel trash can near the refrigerator. I pressed the foot pedal and the lid popped open. On top lay the usual debris: coffee grounds, eggshells, empty wrappers. But my eyes caught a glimpse of thick, glossy paper shoved deep down along the side of the bin, partially obscured by a damp paper towel. I reached down and pulled it out. It was a trifold brochure. The edges were charred and blackened, as if someone had tried to burn it over the stove but gave up halfway through. I brushed off the coffee grounds and unfolded the thick paper. The glossy images showed elderly people sitting in stark, sterile rooms. The bold blue letters across the top read, "Shady Pines Behavioral Health and Memory Care." My eyes scanned the text. This was not an assisted living facility. This was an out-of-state maximum security psychiatric lockdown center. The brochure boasted about their secure dementia wards, chemical management protocols, and fully restricted visitation wings. It was a prison designed for people whose minds had shattered. People who needed to be locked away from the rest of the world. My hands began to tremble from a terrifying surge of pure adrenaline. I flipped the brochure over. Stapled to the back page was a small yellow sticky note. The handwriting was sharp, hurried, and unmistakably Derek's. I stared at the dark blue ink, reading the words over and over again, until they burned into my retinas. The note read, "POA is finalized. The old man signs on Friday." I stopped breathing. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thick to pull into my lungs. POA. Power of attorney. They were not just hiding something illegal down in my basement. They were actively orchestrating a legal coup to steal my entire life. A medical and financial power of attorney would give Derek absolute control over everything I owned: my bank accounts, my pension, my medical decisions, and this house. He would have the legal authority to sign away my freedom. I stood perfectly still, piecing their horrifying puzzle together with cold, mechanical precision. The heavy sedatives Monica had been slipping into my morning routine were never about treating my blood pressure. They were designed to artificially induce severe cognitive decline. They needed me stumbling, slurring my words, and dropping plates to act like a man suffering from rapid-onset dementia. They were creating a documented pattern of mental incompetence. On Friday, Monica would double my dosage. I would be completely incapacitated, staring blankly at a piece of paper I could not comprehend. Derek would put a pen in my hand, guide my fingers, and have me sign away my rights. Once that ink dried, I would cease to exist. I would be shipped off to that maximum security psychiatric facility 2 states away. I would be locked in a sterile room, heavily medicated, cut off from the world. No one would question it. The neighbors had been told I was losing my mind. I would rot in a secure ward until I died, while my son lived in my home, spending my money running their illicit operation in my basement. I looked at the digital clock on the microwave. It was Thursday morning. Friday was tomorrow. I had exactly 24 hours before my own son executed his final maneuver to erase me from society. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal was staggering. It was a cold, calculated assassination of my freedom. I slowly folded the charred brochure and slipped it into my pocket, along with the yellow sticky note. I could not confront them about this. If I screamed or demanded answers, Derek would call the police and claim I was having a violent delusion. With Monica's professional nursing credentials backing him up, they could have me placed on an involuntary psychiatric hold by this afternoon. I slowly washed my hands in the stainless steel sink, watching the cold water spiral down the dark drain. The fear evaporated, replaced by an icy resolve. I was a highly trained structural engineer by trade. I spent 40 years calculating load-bearing capacities, identifying stress fractures, and designing reinforcements to prevent catastrophic collapse. My son had built an impressive framework of lies, but his foundation was flawed. He fundamentally underestimated the structural integrity of the man he was trying to demolish. I dried my hands on a towel. Tomorrow was Friday. Derek expected to find a drugged, compliant old man ready to surrender his life. Instead, he was going to encounter an adversary operating with perfect clarity. But I needed a tactical advantage that bypassed that lock. They thought they secured the basement, but they forgot I built this house. I drafted the blueprints. The timer was counting down to 0. I stepped away from the kitchen sink, calculating the variables of my survival. If Derek and Monica were finalizing a medical and financial power of attorney, by tomorrow morning, they needed to ensure I had no means of fighting back before the ink was dry. I walked into my study and sat at my desk. I needed to check my bank accounts. I needed to see exactly how much of my life they had compromised. I woke my computer from sleep mode and opened my browser. The screen greeted me with a stark error message. No internet connection. I frowned, moving the mouse to the network settings icon at the bottom of the screen. My home network was visible, but when I clicked to connect, a prompt demanded a security key. The password I had used for the last 4 years was rejected. Incorrect password. I tried again, typing slowly and deliberately. Denied. The cold realization washed over me. They had not just changed the lock on the basement door. They had changed the digital locks on my entire life. They had severed my connection to the outside world. My heart hammered a slow, rhythmic warning against my ribs. If the network was locked down, what else had they taken? I pulled open the top drawer of my desk and reached for my worn leather wallet. I flipped it open. My driver's license was there, smiling back at me from a better time. But the leather slots that usually held my 3 credit cards and my primary bank debit card were completely empty. I ran my fingers over the smooth, vacant leather. They had stripped me of my financial mobility. Without those cards, without access to my accounts, I could not hire a lawyer. I could not buy a plane ticket. I could not even rent a hotel room to get away from them. I was a prisoner bound not by iron chains, but by the systematic dismantling of my independence. The sound of the heavy front door opening echoed through the hallway. Derek was home. I heard the jingle of his keys as he dropped them into the ceramic bowl by the entrance. I closed my wallet, left it on the desk, and took a deep, steadying breath. I needed to act. I needed to push back just enough to test the boundaries of their cage without letting them know I saw the bars. I shuffled out of the study, letting my shoulders slump, letting a look of mild, generalized confusion wash over my features. Derek was standing in the foyer, loosening his expensive silk tie. He looked up as I approached. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice laced with that artificial, patronizing warmth I now recognized as a weapon. "How was your afternoon? Did you get some rest?" "Derek," I said, pitching my voice slightly higher, adding a slight waver to my tone. "I was just looking for my wallet. I wanted to order a book online, but I cannot seem to find my credit cards. I looked in the drawer, but they are gone. Did you see them anywhere?" Derek sighed, a long, exaggerated sound of exhausted patience. He walked over to me and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. His grip was tight, subtly restraining. "Dad, you lost them again yesterday, remember? We tore the whole living room apart looking for them. You were so upset. Do not worry, though. I called the banks and canceled them to protect your identity. You are getting so forgetful lately, and I just want to keep you safe. I will help you order your book later, okay? You just go relax." I stared at him, forcing my eyes to widen in mock surprise. We had not looked for any cards yesterday. I had spent the entire afternoon reading in my chair while he was downstairs in the basement. He was lying straight to my face, building a false history to overwrite my reality. I lost them, I murmured, rubbing my forehead as if trying to soothe an aching brain. I do not remember that. Are you sure? I am sure, Dad, Derek said, his tone dripping with fake pity. He offered a tight, sympathetic smile. It is just the natural progression of things. Let me handle the stress. You go sit down. He patted my shoulder twice, a condescending dismissal, and walked toward the kitchen to find his wife. I stood in the foyer, my fingernails digging into my palms. The sheer audacity of his lie was staggering. He was gaslighting me with the practiced ease of a seasoned predator. He was not just stealing my money. He was stealing my sanity, convincing me that my own mind was a traitor. I swallowed the burning bile in my throat and turned away. I could not let the anger show. I had to remain the clueless old man. I walked into the living room and moved toward the large bay window that overlooked the front yard. The late afternoon sun cast long, dark shadows across the manicured grass. I parted the heavy curtains just a fraction, peering outside. Monica was standing on the sidewalk near our mailbox. She was talking to Mrs. Gable, our next-door neighbor of 20 years. Mrs. Gable was a sweet, gossipy woman who knew everyone in the neighborhood. I watched them through the glass. I could not hear their words, but their body language told a story that chilled me to the bone. Monica had her hands clasped to her chest, her face twisted into a mask of tragic sorrow. She was shaking her head slowly, playing the role of the exhausted, heartbroken caregiver. Mrs. Gable reached out and touched Monica's arm in a gesture of deep sympathy. Then Monica did it. She leaned in closer to Mrs. Gable, lowered her voice, and raised her right hand. She pointed a manicured finger at her own temple and made small, circular motions, the universal gesture for crazy. She then let her hand drop, sighed dramatically, and looked back toward our house with a look of profound pity. Mrs. Gable covered her mouth in shock, her eyes darting toward my living room window. I stepped back into the shadows. The message was clear. Monica was broadcasting my fabricated decline to the neighborhood. She was seeding the ground. If I ever ran out screaming for help, if I ever tried to tell anyone that my son was holding me hostage and laundering money in my basement, they would not believe a single word. They would simply look at me with pity, shake their heads, and call Derek to collect his poor delusional father. The psychological warfare was absolute. They had surrounded me with an impenetrable wall. My finances were cut off. My digital access was blocked. My social credibility was destroyed. I was utterly isolated. I stood in the darkness, the weight of their strategy pressing down on my chest. They had thought of everything. They had built a perfect cage. But isolation also meant they were no longer looking closely at my actions. I just needed the structural blueprints, and I knew every line by heart. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the living room floor. I turned away from the window and slowly made my way toward the kitchen. The smell of roasted garlic and rosemary filled the air. Monica was pulling a baking sheet from the oven, her movements brisk and efficient. Derek sat at the island counter, tapping away on his smartphone. It was time for dinner, and it was time for me to give the performance of my life. If I was going to survive, I had to weaponize their absolute underestimation of me. I had to become the tragic, decaying old man they desperately needed me to be. I shuffled into the kitchen, intentionally dragging my left foot against the hardwood floor to create a rhythmic, heavy scuffing sound. I let my shoulders slump forward, rounding my spine to diminish my height. I relaxed the muscles in my face, letting my jaw hang slightly slack, and forced my eyes to adopt a vacant, unfocused stare. I walked toward the dining table, pretending to lose my balance for a fraction of a second, catching myself heavily against the back of a wooden chair. Derek glanced up from his phone. "Careful, Dad," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any real concern. "Have a seat. Dinner is almost ready." I sank into the chair, letting out a long, ragged sigh. I placed my hands on the table and willed them to shake. It is surprisingly difficult to mimic a severe tremor when your nervous system is perfectly calm, but I channeled the nervous energy thrumming in my chest down into my fingertips. My hands vibrated against the polished wood. Monica brought over 3 plates, setting one down in front of me, with a patronizing smile. "Here you go, Dad," she said brightly. "Nice and hot. Eat up." I stared at the chicken and roasted potatoes as if I had never seen food before. I picked up my fork with a jerky, uncoordinated movement. I brought it to the chicken, but intentionally missed, scraping the tines loudly against the ceramic plate. I tried again, my hand trembling violently. I lifted a small piece of potato toward my mouth, but let my grip falter. The fork clattered onto the plate, and the food tumbled onto my lap. "Oh, goodness!" I mumbled, slurring my words together, letting panic seep into my voice. "I am sorry. I cannot seem to." I reached down to brush the food off my trousers, knocking over my glass of water in the process. The water spilled across the table, soaking into the fabric placemats and dripping down onto the floor. I let out a soft, pathetic groan, clutching my head with both hands. I squeezed my eyes shut, rocking back and forth in the chair. "I do not know what is happening," I whimpered. "My head is so fuzzy. I cannot remember how to do this." I waited for the soothing, fake reassurance. I waited for Monica to pat my arm and tell me it was going to be all right. But it did not come. Instead, the kitchen went completely silent. I kept my face buried in my hands, but I peeked through the gaps in my fingers. Derek was staring at me. There was no pity in his eyes. There was no sadness for a father losing his dignity. There was only a cold, clinical satisfaction. He looked at the spilled water, then up at his wife. Monica was standing by the stove holding a dish towel. The sweet, caring nurse persona had completely vanished. Her face was hard, her lips pressed into a thin, cruel line. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. It was the look you might give a dying insect on your kitchen floor. She tossed the dish towel onto the counter with a sharp, dismissive flick of her wrist. "Just leave it," Derek said quietly, not moving a muscle to help me clean the mess. "He is completely out of it today." Monica walked over to the table and leaned down next to Derek. She did not bother to lower her voice to a whisper. She spoke in a hushed, casual tone, entirely confident that the pathetic old man, sitting 3 feet away, could not comprehend a single word. "The dosage is perfect," Monica murmured, her eyes fixed on my trembling form. "He is a vegetable. I bumped it up this morning. He will not even know what hit him by Friday." Derek smirked, picking up his fork and taking a bite of his dinner. "Good. The lawyer sent over the final draft of the power of attorney. We just need him breathing enough to hold a pen. After that, we can wrap this up and get him transported out of here. The buyers for the basement merchandise are getting anxious." "Do not worry," Monica replied, pouring herself a glass of wine. "By Friday morning, his brain will be absolute mush. He will sign whatever we put in front of him. Then we can finally have this house to ourselves without dealing with his depressing dead weight." They clinked their glasses together, a quiet toast to my impending destruction. I sat there, surrounded by spilled water and ruined food, maintaining my erratic rocking motion. My heart was pounding like a war drum. Friday. They had explicitly confirmed the deadline. Today was Wednesday evening. That meant I had exactly 48 hours before they escalated their plan to the final stage. I closed my eyes and let out another low, confused moan, purely for their benefit. Internally, my mind was racing through a complex web of logistics. 48 hours was a desperately narrow window. I needed to execute a counteroffensive that would not only expose their criminal enterprise, but also completely dismantle their legal trap. If I acted too soon, they would use the forged medical records and my supposed cognitive decline to lock me away. If I acted too late, I would be heavily sedated, legally stripped of my assets, and banished to a secure psychiatric facility while they sold my home to a violent loan shark. I had to gather irrefutable evidence of the contraband in the basement. I had to secure my financial assets. I had to contact my lawyer and assemble the authorities. And I had to do all of it while remaining trapped inside a house with two predators who were watching my every move. I stopped rocking and slowly lifted my head. I looked at Derek with a vacant, watery gaze. "I think I need to lie down," I whispered, letting my voice trail off into a weak rasp. "I am so tired." Derek did not even look up from his plate. "Go ahead, Dad. Monica will clean up the mess. You just get some sleep." I pushed myself up from the table, leaning heavily on the chair for support. I shuffled out of the kitchen, dragging my feet, playing the part of the broken victim all the way down the hall. But as soon as I stepped into the shadows of my bedroom and closed the door behind me, the frail facade vanished. I stood up straight, my spine rigid, my breathing calm and controlled. The disgust in Monica's eyes, the cold indifference in my son's voice, it had extinguished any lingering trace of paternal hesitation. They had declared war on my life. They had turned my sanctuary into a slaughterhouse. I walked over to the closet and retrieved the hidden flashlight. I unscrewed the base and dropped the evening dose of white pills inside. I looked at the small pile of toxic tablets. They were the physical proof of my attempted erasure. I screwed the flashlight back together and placed it on the shelf. I had 48 hours. 48 hours to build a trap of my own. I was going to let them walk right into it. When the steel doors slammed shut behind them, they would finally understand the devastating consequence of underestimating an engineer. The clock was ticking. Every second was a precious commodity. I walked over to the window and looked out at the dark street. The neighborhood was quiet, unaware of the treacherous battlefield my home had become. I took a deep breath. I was truly ready. The digital clock on my bedside table flipped to exactly 3 in the morning. I had been lying perfectly still for hours, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the house, waiting for the absolute silence that signaled Derek and Monica were in a deep sleep. I slipped out from under the heavy down comforter, leaving the mattress undisturbed, so the springs would not creak. I dressed quickly in the dark, pulling on a pair of dark wool slacks and a heavy navy sweater. I moved with the practiced, silent grace of a man who knew every millimeter, every settling joint, and every squeaky floorboard of his own home. I bypassed the treacherous hallway rug and slipped out the back door, leaving the latch unlocked. The cool night air hit my face sharp, clean, and invigorating. I crossed the sprawling backyard, keeping my silhouette pressed against the deep shadows cast by the large elm trees, until I reached my old detached workshop at the edge of the property line. Derek had deemed this workshop a rusted, useless relic months ago and never bothered to step foot inside. He should have. I walked past the dusty table saw and reached directly behind the heavy steel workbench, feeling along the masonry wall for a specific loose brick. I pulled it free with a soft scrape and retrieved a small waterproof metal tin hidden in the cavity. Inside lay $2,000 in crisp, large denomination bills, an emergency cash stash I had securely hidden away a decade ago. I pocketed the thick roll of currency, slid the brick perfectly back into place, and stepped out into the quiet, desolate street. The walk to the nearest fully illuminated corner convenience store was exactly 2 miles. Just a few days ago, before the chemical fog had lifted from my brain, a simple walk down the driveway to the mailbox would have left me gasping for air, clutching my chest in manufactured exhaustion. Tonight my stride was long, powerful, and remarkably purposeful. The physical exertion felt absolutely magnificent. It was a tangible, undeniable confirmation that my body belonged to me again, that the poison had completely left my system. I moved briskly down the empty concrete sidewalks, bathed in the sickly orange glow of the flickering streetlights. A solitary stray dog watched me intensely from across the street, but otherwise the suburban landscape was entirely abandoned. After 40 minutes of rapid walking, the bright, garish neon sign of the convenience store cut through the darkness ahead like a beacon. The electronic bell above the glass door chimed loudly as I walked inside, the sound echoing in the sterile space. The teenage clerk behind the counter barely looked up from his magazine, his eyes glazed with late-night boredom. I walked straight to the small electronics display in the back corner, grabbed a cheap prepaid cellular phone, and selected 2 high-capacity activation cards. I approached the register and placed the plastic items on the scratched counter, smoothing out 3 crisp, large denomination bills from my pocket. The clerk processed the transaction with a massive drawn-out yawn, sliding the plastic bag toward me without a single word. I did not wait to return to the treacherous confines of my home. I stood in the harsh, buzzing fluorescent light of the store parking lot, ripped open the stubborn packaging, inserted the small battery, and immediately dialed the automated activation code. Within 3 tense minutes, the screen illuminated. I finally had a secure, untraceable line of communication to the outside world. I dialed a specific number I had memorized over 30 years ago. Warren Mitchell was my absolute oldest friend, and more importantly, the most ruthless, terrifying corporate litigator in the entire city. If Derek mistakenly thought he was a cunning, brilliant strategist, he had clearly never crossed paths with a legal shark like Warren. The line rang 4 agonizing times before a gruff, sleep-heavy voice finally answered. I did not bother with any polite pleasantries or standard apologies for calling at such an unreasonable hour. I simply spoke his name, my voice remarkably low, incredibly rapid, and undeniably commanding. I told him it was Richard, and I told him to wake up immediately and listen very carefully to every single word I was about to say. I heard the sudden rustle of heavy sheets and the solid, heavy thud of his bare feet hitting the hardwood floor. Warren was instantly dangerously alert. I laid out the entire horrific situation in precise, chronological, and analytical order. I told him about the daily chemical restraints, the brilliantly forged cognitive decline, the biometric security lock on my basement door, and the charred brochure for the psychiatric lockdown facility. Finally, I told him about the handwritten yellow sticky note explicitly mentioning the power of attorney. Warren did not interrupt me once. He absorbed the shocking information with the cold, calculating silence of an apex predator actively assessing a complex, active battlefield. When I completely finished my explanation, he let out an incredibly long, heavy breath, his voice instantly shedding any lingering trace of sleep. He told me with terrifying calm that he was going to tear Derek apart piece by piece, but he needed an absolute, unrestricted mandate to operate. I gave it to him immediately without hesitation. I instructed Warren to launch an immediate, highly covert investigation into my entire financial portfolio. I needed to know exactly which bank accounts Derek had illicitly accessed, what specific funds had been aggressively moved, and the exact legal parameters of the specific power of attorney document he was aggressively planning to execute on Friday morning. Warren quickly agreed, stating confidently that he would have his absolute best forensic accountants dissecting my assets by the time the sun came up. However, his professional tone abruptly shifted, becoming incredibly grave and urgently cautious. He explicitly warned me that if Derek had already filed preliminary medical documentation officially claiming I was severely cognitively incapacitated, my current legal standing was virtually non-existent. Warren meticulously explained that if I foolishly raised an alarm right now, or if I angrily confronted Derek without a completely bulletproof legal injunction already in place, Derek could seamlessly and legally invoke an emergency medical authority. He could effortlessly have me forcibly committed to a locked psychiatric ward by sunrise, permanently rendering any subsequent claims I made as the tragic paranoid ramblings of a deeply sick dementia patient. Warren forcefully stressed that I absolutely had to remain entirely, convincingly passive. I had to quietly go back to the house, completely swallow my burning pride, and continue flawlessly playing the role of the drooling, oblivious, and compliant victim. I had to enthusiastically let Derek fully believe he was in absolute, unquestioned control of the entire situation until our hidden trap finally snapped shut around his neck. I agreed, gripping the plastic phone tightly in my sweating hand. I ended the short call, the electronic dial tone buzzing sharply in the quiet, freezing night. I turned around and began the incredibly long 2-mile walk back to my heavily guarded residential prison, perfectly ready to play the pathetic, tragic fool for exactly one last day. The freezing wind whipped across my face as I retraced my steps through the desolate suburban streets. My muscles ached with a deep, unfamiliar fatigue, but I forced my legs to maintain a steady rhythm. I navigated the final stretch of my neighborhood, clinging to the deep shadows of the oak trees, terrified that a motion sensor light would expose my excursion. I slipped through the unlocked back door, the familiar scent of lemon polish and stale betrayal greeting me in the dark kitchen. I moved with agonizing slowness, testing every floorboard before shifting my weight until I finally reached the sanctuary of my bedroom. I shed the heavy wool sweater and dark slacks, hiding them at the bottom of my laundry hamper, and crawled back under the comforter. My physical body demanded rest, but my mind was an electrified battlefield. I stared at the ceiling, watching the faint gray light of dawn creep across the plaster, waiting for the small plastic device hidden under my mattress to vibrate. I had to remain completely passive. I had to let them think they were winning. The burner phone hummed against the wooden bed frame just after 9 in the morning. I had already completed my morning routine, shuffling through the kitchen, swallowing the toxic pills and spitting them into my hidden flashlight. Derek and Monica were downstairs, cheerfully discussing a new landscaping project for the backyard, as if they owned the property. I locked the bedroom door, retrieved the cheap plastic phone, and pressed it tightly against my ear. Warren did not bother with a greeting. His voice was a harsh, gravelly whisper, entirely devoid of his usual courtroom bluster. He sounded genuinely shaken, a terrifying tone from a man who spent his career dismantling corporate empires. He told me to sit down. I ignored him, pacing the length of my carpeted floor, demanding the unvarnished truth. What Warren delivered was a sequence of devastating facts that shattered the foundation of my reality. The medical and financial power of attorney was not just a future threat. It was already a legally binding reality. Warren explained that Derek had not waited for Friday to secure my signature. He had completely bypassed me. Utilizing Monica's extensive medical connections, they procured a falsified neurological evaluation from a corrupt out-of-network physician. This fabricated document explicitly stated that I was suffering from advanced-stage Alzheimer's disease and lacked any capacity to manage my own affairs. Armed with this fraudulent medical declaration, Derek forged my signature on a power of attorney document and had a notary, likely another paid accomplice, stamp it as authentic. Friday was not the day I would sign the papers. Friday was the day the finalized legal transfer officially cleared the county courts, stripping me of my autonomy. They had legally assassinated me on paper, but the theft of my identity was merely the prologue to a much larger, catastrophic financial crime. Warren paused, taking a long, ragged breath before delivering the final blow. Derek weaponized his newly acquired legal authority to leverage the one asset I had spent my entire adult life protecting. He had taken out a massive home equity line of credit against my property. My beautiful custom-built, completely mortgage-free mansion, the home I designed with my own hands and paid off 20 years ago, was now severely encumbered. Warren read the numbers with cold, surgical precision. The bank had approved a loan for exactly $2 million. My son had mortgaged the physical manifestation of my life's work to steal a fortune. The sheer audacity of the crime left me paralyzed. I leaned against the heavy oak dresser, my breathing shallow and erratic, as the scale of Derek's betrayal washed over me. He had not just stolen my money. He had stolen the roof over my head. I asked Warren where the $2 million had gone, desperately hoping we could freeze the accounts. Warren's answer extinguished that fragile hope instantly. The money had not sat in a domestic account for more than 10 minutes. Derek utilized a complex web of rapid wire transfers to immediately push the entire sum into encrypted offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. The money was completely gone, swallowed by a digital black hole. But why did an average corporate manager need $2 million in untraceable cash? Warren deployed a private investigator to dig into Derek's recent activities, and the truth was terrifying. Derek had developed a severe catastrophic gambling addiction. He had accumulated massive debts playing in illegal underground poker games. He did not owe money to a bank. He owed money to a brutal, violent, local organized crime syndicate. The heavy metallic crates sitting in my basement were not filled with stolen merchandise or illegal narcotics. Warren's investigator had identified the men who delivered them. They were enforcers for the loan shark. The crates contained sophisticated high-end counterfeit printing plates and massive bundles of illicit currency waiting to be washed. Derek had literally leased out my secure suburban basement to a violent criminal enterprise as a safe house and collateral vault. The $2 million loan was a panicked payment to keep them from breaking his legs, but it was not enough to clear the total debt. My house was the final collateral. If Derek defaulted on the remaining balance, or if he tried to run, the criminals would seize the property. They would take the house, and they would not care if an old, demented man was still living inside it. The out-of-state psychiatric lockdown facility was not just a cruel punishment. It was a mandatory clearing tactic. Derek had to physically remove me from the premises by Friday so he could hand the keys over to a violent crime syndicate. I stood in the center of my bedroom, surrounded by the physical artifacts of a life that no longer belonged to me. The intricate woodwork, the antique furnishings, the framed photographs of a smiling family that never truly existed. It was all a hollow, fragile facade, hiding a dark, rotting core of deception and immense danger. My son had sold me out to save his own skin, turning my sanctuary into a criminal stronghold. Warren wanted to send private security to extract me immediately. I firmly refused. If I fled the property, I would instantly become a fugitive from my own legally documented medical condition. Derek would notify the authorities that his severely demented father wandered off, triggering a massive public search. The police would drag me back, hand me over to my son, and escort me directly to the locked psychiatric ward. Fleeing was a guaranteed death sentence. I told Warren to prepare the maximum legal retaliation possible, but to hold everything until I gave the final signal. I hung up the phone and walked over to my closet. I reached up and grabbed the flashlight, feeling the weight of the toxic pills rattling inside. The old man they chemically manufactured was dead. The grieving father who loved his son was dead. There was only the structural engineer left, and he was ready to demolish this operation. Thursday morning arrived with a suffocating tension. I performed my final act of docile submission at the breakfast table, accepting the pills from Monica with a trembling hand and a vacant smile. As soon as I heard the water running in the kitchen sink, I shuffled to the bathroom and deposited the poison into the hollow flashlight. Today was the day. Derek walked into the living room in a sharp suit, adjusting his tie. Monica followed closely behind, carrying a thick leather binder that undoubtedly contained the fraudulent medical evaluations and the forged power of attorney. Derek looked over at me, his eyes cold and calculating. He told me they had an urgent meeting downtown and would be gone for 3 hours. He instructed me to stay in my armchair, warning me not to touch the stove or answer the door. I nodded slowly, letting my chin rest against my chest, and mumbled a confused agreement. The moment the front door clicked shut and the deadbolt engaged, my lethargy vanished. I sprang from the armchair and moved rapidly to the front window, watching Derek's luxury sedan pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street. I moved to the rear of the house, stepping out onto the back patio. A small courier box was tucked discreetly behind the ceramic planter next to the grill. Warren had arranged for a private operative to drop it off before sunrise. I grabbed the package and brought it inside, slicing the heavy tape with a knife. Inside lay 4 micro cameras, 2 audio transmitters, and a digital receiver synced to my burner phone. It was military-grade surveillance equipment. I gathered the equipment into a small canvas tool bag and walked over to the kitchen pantry. The biometric keypad on the basement door was an impressive piece of security, but Derek was fundamentally ignorant of structural engineering. When I designed and built this house 30 years ago, incorporated a secondary heavily concealed access route, to the lower foundation. It was an unmapped OVAC chase, a vertical crawl space intended to allow easy routing for future plumbing or electrical expansions without tearing down drywall. I pushed aside the heavy sacks of flour and canned goods on the bottom shelf of the pantry. Using a flathead screwdriver from my kitchen drawer, I carefully pried the wooden baseboard away from the wall. Behind the baseboard was a solid panel of reinforced plywood. I pressed my palms against the top corners and pushed upward. The panel slid out of its tracks with a soft, dusty scrape, revealing a pitch-black, vertical shaft that dropped directly down into the basement utility room. A wave of stale, cold air rushed up from the darkness, carrying the faint, metallic scent of machinery and ink. I strapped the canvas bag across my chest, grabbed a small penlight, and positioned myself at the edge of the narrow shaft. I exhaled slowly, flattening my shoulders, and slid into the dark void. The descent was tight and incredibly claustrophobic. The rough wooden studs and cold metal ductwork pressed hard against my ribs. My muscles burned with intense physical exertion, but the pain was a glorious reminder of my recovered strength. I navigated the vertical drop by bracing my boots against the interior crossbeams, lowering myself inch by inch through the suffocating darkness. 10 feet down, the shaft abruptly leveled out into a horizontal ventilation corridor that ran directly above the basement ceiling. I crawled forward on my elbows and knees, breathing in the thick, decades-old dust until I reached the heavy iron grate overlooking the main basement floor. I carefully unscrewed the mounting bolts of the iron grate, lifting it quietly into the ductwork, and lowered myself down onto the concrete floor of the utility room. I stood up and switched on my penlight, sweeping the narrow beam across the cavernous space. The sight before me was chilling. Derek had completely transformed my woodworking shop and storage area into a sophisticated criminal staging ground. The 2 massive steel crates I had seen delivered in the dead of night were pried open. Inside the first crate sat a heavy industrial-grade offset printing press, smelling sharply of chemical solvents and industrial lubricants. The second crate was filled with stacked metal plates engraved with the intricate microscopic designs of high-denomination currency. Scattered across my old oak workbenches were hundreds of tight-banded stacks of cash ready to be washed and integrated into the legitimate banking system. It was a massive, highly organized counterfeiting and laundering operation running directly beneath my living room. Derek had collateralized my home to fund a printing hub for a violent syndicate. If the authorities raided this house right now, they would find millions of dollars in fake currency and the equipment to produce more, all housed within a property legally registered entirely in my name. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hardened my resolve into solid steel. I did not have time to process the emotional shock. I had a job to do. I unzipped the canvas bag and pulled out the micro cameras. I moved systematically through the basement, applying the exact rigorous precision I used to draft architectural blueprints. I mounted the first micro camera high up in the corner of the room, concealing the tiny lens perfectly behind a thick cluster of insulated copper wiring. This angle provided a comprehensive, unobstructed view of the printing press and the main workbenches. I installed the second camera directly above the heavy steel crates, hiding it within the casing of a broken fluorescent light fixture, ensuring a clear, high-definition view of the counterfeit plates and anyone handling them. I carefully wired the miniature audio transmitters along the primary ventilation ducts, spacing them evenly to capture every whisper and transaction that took place in this subterranean vault. I synced the transmitters to the digital receiver, verifying the encrypted connection. My burner phone buzzed softly in my pocket. I pulled it out and opened the secure application Warren had installed. The screen flickered before displaying 2 crystal-clear live video feeds of the criminal operation. The audio was razor-sharp. I had absolute undeniable eyes and ears jewels on the syndicate's staging ground. The trap was perfectly laid. I checked my watch. 1 hour and 45 minutes had passed. Derek and Monica would be wrapping up their legal meeting soon. I quickly repacked my canvas bag, ensuring I left absolutely no trace of my presence on the concrete floor. I climbed back onto the utility sink, reached up into the dark ceiling, and pulled myself back into the horizontal ventilation corridor. I replaced the iron grate securing the bolts and began the vertical climb back up the hidden HVAC shaft. My arms screamed in protest and my lungs burned, but adrenaline fueled my desperate ascent. I emerged through the pantry wall, sliding the heavy plywood panel back into its tracks and securely snapping the wooden baseboard into place. I carefully brushed the thick dust from my dark clothes, washed my hands thoroughly in the kitchen sink, and returned to my armchair in the living room. I finally had the basement. I sat in the worn leather armchair, my breathing finally slowing, as the adrenaline of my initial descent began to fade. I stared at the burner phone resting in my lap. The dual camera feeds displayed the basement with crystal clarity, but as my eyes scanned the digital perimeter, a cold realization struck me. Tucked away in the far back corner, completely hidden beneath a heavy canvas tarp, and just out of the primary camera angle sat a third metallic crate. Unlike the open containers holding the counterfeit press, this crate was sealed tight with thick steel bands and a heavy industrial padlock. My new digital eyes could not see inside it. The authorities would need absolute, irrefutable physical proof of every single item housed in that room. I glanced at the grandfather clock, ticking against the living room wall. Derek and Monica were not scheduled to return from their lawyer for another 40 minutes. I had to go back down. My muscles protested violently as I pushed myself up from the comfortable chair. I walked back into the kitchen, slid the heavy reinforced plywood panel open again, and plunged myself into the suffocating darkness of the hidden HVAC crawlspace. The journey down felt infinitely more punishing the second time. The rough wooden studs scraped against my shoulders, and the cold metal ductwork chilled my sweating skin. I navigated the vertical drop with grim determination, lowering my body inch by inch until I reached the horizontal ventilation corridor. I crawled forward on my bruised elbows, lifted the heavy iron grate, and dropped silently onto the cold concrete floor of the basement. I moved quickly past the counterfeit printing press, heading straight for the shadowy corner where the third crate rested. I pulled the heavy canvas tarp away, exposing the thick steel bands. I reached into my canvas tool bag and pulled out a small flat titanium pry bar and a pair of heavy wire snips. I wedged the titanium pry bar beneath the corner of the padlock, applying steady, calculated pressure to snap the internal locking mechanism without generating a loud metallic clang. The cheap metal casing yielded with a soft, satisfying click. I gently removed the broken padlock and slipped it into my pocket. Using the heavy wire snips, I expertly clipped the thick steel shipping bands, catching them with my free hand before they could strike the concrete floor and echo through the house. I set my tools down quietly and placed both hands under the heavy metallic lid of the crate. I lifted it slowly, easing the rusted hinges backward. A pungent chemical odor immediately wafted up from the dark interior, mixing unpleasantly with the damp, earthy smell of the basement. I clicked on my small penlight and directed the narrow white beam downward, illuminating the tightly packed contents. This was not the discarded medical equipment Derek had claimed was arriving. The crate was filled to the brim with perfectly organized, shrink-wrapped stacks of illicit $100 bills, completely dwarfing the loose currency scattered on the workbenches nearby. But the money was only a fraction of the devastating inventory. Packed tightly next to the financial contraband were dozens of large, vacuum-sealed plastic bricks containing a dense, chalky white powder. Illegal narcotics. The sheer volume of the drugs indicated a highly sophisticated, incredibly lucrative distribution network. Derek had not simply leased my basement to a local loan shark to pay off a gambling debt. He had actively transformed my peaceful suburban home into a primary staging ground for a massive multi-million-dollar narcotics and money laundering syndicate. The scale of the criminal enterprise operating beneath my floorboards was staggering, elevating the danger to a completely lethal level. I carefully moved one of the heavy narcotic bricks aside to inspect the very bottom of the crate. Hidden beneath a false cardboard floor lay a thick, heavily bound manila envelope. I pulled it out and opened the metal clasp, shining my penlight over the thick stack of papers inside. They were forged property deeds, highly sophisticated legal transfers, bearing perfectly replicated county seals and notarized signatures. I sifted through the documents, my heart pounding a furious rhythm against my ribs. There were deeds for commercial warehouses, residential apartment complexes, and vast tracts of undeveloped land across the state. And there, near the very bottom of the stack, was the fully finalized, meticulously forged deed to my own house. The signature at the bottom was a flawless replication of my handwriting, authorizing the total transfer of my property to an anonymous shell corporation. The power of attorney was just the mechanism. This forged deed was the ultimate finalized weapon. They were legally stealing the ground beneath my feet, piece by physical piece. I took my burner phone from my pocket and swiftly snapped high-resolution photographs of every single document, every brick of narcotics, and every wrapped stack of cash. I documented the serial numbers, the forged signatures, and the absolute proof of my son's catastrophic betrayal. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and began to carefully reorganize the contents of the crate, placing the manila envelope back under the false cardboard floor and arranging the narcotic bricks exactly as I had found them. I was reaching for the heavy metallic lid to lower it back into place when a sudden, terrifying sound shattered the silence above me. The heavy front door of the house slammed shut with a violent, reverberating thud. "I cannot believe the lawyer made us wait that long." Derek's voice boomed from the upstairs hallway, his heavy footsteps marching directly toward the kitchen. "We need to get the paperwork finalized right now." Monica's voice echoed behind him, sharp and agitated. "Just go check the basement inventory quickly. I will go make sure the old man is still asleep in his chair." A jolt of pure, paralyzing panic shot through my nervous system. They were back incredibly early. I had absolutely no time to think. I had mere seconds to erase my presence before Derek opened that basement door. I slammed the metallic lid of the crate down, my hands moving with frantic, desperate speed. I grabbed the clipped steel bands and shoved them deep into my pockets alongside the broken padlock. I pulled the heavy canvas tarp back over the crate, perfectly mirroring its original undisturbed placement in the dark corner. I dropped to my hands and knees on the cold concrete floor, using the sleeve of my heavy wool sweater to frantically wipe away the visible footprints I had left in the thick dust. I scrambled backward toward the utility sink, erasing my tracks as I moved. Upstairs, the heavy footsteps moved closer to the basement stairwell. I heard the distinct electronic beep of the biometric keypad registering a thumbprint. The lock disengaged with a loud mechanical clack. I leaped onto the edge of the utility sink, grabbed the bottom frame of the open ventilation duct, and hoisted my entire body upward with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength. I threw myself into the horizontal crawl space just as the heavy basement door swung open, casting a long beam of yellow light. I pressed my body flat against the cold ductwork, burying my face into my forearms to muffle the sound of my ragged breathing. Below me, through the iron grate, a heavy beam of yellow light sliced across the concrete floor. Derek stepped into the utility room, his shoes clicking sharply against the cement. Monica was right behind him, breathing heavily from their rapid return. I closed my eyes, praying I had not left a single smudge of dust or a misplaced tool. Derek walked directly toward the third crate. I heard the heavy canvas tarp rustle as he pulled it back. A suffocating silence stretched for 10 seconds. Then Derek sighed. He told Monica everything was exactly as they left it, and the padlock was secure. He dropped the tarp. Monica muttered a complaint about her anxiety and demanded they go upstairs to finalize the paperwork. The basement door shut, and the biometric lock engaged with a final beep. I waited in the absolute darkness of the shaft for 20 agonizing minutes before I dared to move. I crawled backward, descending the vertical drop with burning muscles, and slipped silently back through the pantry wall. I secured the baseboard, smoothed out the flour bags, and ghosted into my bedroom, just as Derek called my name from the living room, checking if I was awake. The rest of Thursday passed in a blur of calculated deception. I played the heavily sedated fading patriarch with absolute perfection. I stared blankly at the television-chewed dinner with agonizing slowness and allowed Monica to guide me to my bedroom shortly after 8 o'clock. She tucked me in with a sweet smile, turned out the lights, and closed the door. I lay perfectly still in the darkness, staring at the ceiling fan, listening as the ambient sounds of the house faded into the quiet hum of the suburban night. At 11 o'clock, the real work began. I pulled the burner phone from beneath the mattress and retrieved the small wireless earpiece I had purchased at the convenience store. I pressed the earpiece firmly into my ear and activated the secure application. The digital screen illuminated my face with a faint blue glow. The micro cameras in the basement showed an empty, dimly lit room, but I knew they were coming. Derek had mentioned that the buyers were getting anxious. Tonight was the final staging before my execution tomorrow. Exactly at midnight, the live audio feed cracked with the sharp hiss of static. The heavy basement door swung open. The bright overhead fluorescent lights snapped on, flooding the subterranean room with stark illumination. Through the camera feed, I watched Derek and Monica descend the wooden stairs. They were followed closely by two men. The first man was the massive, broad-shouldered enforcer I had seen delivering the crates. He wore a dark leather jacket and carried a heavy metal briefcase. He moved with the predatory grace of a man entirely comfortable with extreme violence. He dropped the briefcase onto my old oak workbench, the sound echoing loudly through my earpiece. The loan shark cracked his knuckles and looked directly at Derek, demanding a complete status update on the laundering cycle. Derek immediately launched into a frantic, placating explanation. He nervously assured the enforcer that the printing press was operating at maximum efficiency and that the latest batch of washed currency was perfectly bundled and ready for immediate transit. He swore that the entirety of his remaining debt would be cleared by the weekend. The enforcer sneered casually, tracing the edge of the counterfeit printing press with his thick fingers. He stated in a low, gravelly tone that his boss was running out of patience and that the house better be legally secured by tomorrow, or they would simply burn the property down with everyone inside it. Derek swallowed hard, desperately nodding his head. He eagerly promised that the legal framework was completely flawless. He turned toward the stairwell and gestured for the fourth person to step completely into the room. I shifted my focus to the second camera angle, watching the shadowed figure descend the final few steps into the harsh light. When the man finally came into clear focus, the breath violently hitched in my throat. I felt an icy, paralyzing shockwave detonate deep inside my chest. I knew that face perfectly well. I knew that posture. I knew the expensive gold watch gleaming on his left wrist. It was Dr. Lawrence Aris. He was my primary care physician. He was the man who had monitored my heart, checked my cholesterol, and asked about my golf handicap for the past 15 years. He had attended my late wife's funeral. He was a pillar of the local medical community. And he was in my basement, standing next to a violent loan shark and an illegal narcotics operation. Dr. Aris adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat. His voice, usually so measured, compassionate, and reassuring, during my annual checkups, now echoed through my earpiece with a chilling, arrogant indifference. He looked at Derek and asked if the financial transfer was ready. Derek pulled a thick, banded stack of $100 bills from the workbench and handed it directly to my trusted physician. Aris thumbed through the illicit cash with practiced ease, slipping the thick bundle into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He smiled a cold, calculating grin that made my stomach aggressively churn. He casually informed the group that his administrative staff had officially uploaded the final fabricated neurological evaluations to the state medical database just an hour ago. He proudly boasted that the incredibly detailed, fictitious medical charts he had meticulously crafted painted a tragic, undeniable picture of rapid aggressive Alzheimer's disease. I lay paralyzed in my dark bedroom, the horrifying magnitude of the conspiracy finally taking complete shape. Derek had not bypassed the medical system. He had simply bought it. Dr. Aris had eagerly sold his medical license, his ethical oath, and my entire life for a stack of counterfeit money. I listened in unadulterated horror as Aris calmly explained the specific legal mechanics to the loan shark. He confidently stated that the medical power of attorney was now completely unassailable. He laughed lightly, a sickening callous sound, and mentioned that he had even prescribed the heavy mind-altering sedatives Monica was actively using to keep me chemically subdued, ensuring the physical symptoms perfectly matched the fabricated medical records. Aris assured the enforcer that by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, Richard Lawson would be classified as an incompetent ward of the state. He guaranteed the transfer to the out-of-state psychiatric lockdown facility was already fully authorized and paid for. I pulled the earpiece from my ear hands, shaking with sudden fury. The betrayal was absolute. My own son, my trusted nurse, and my lifelong physician had conspired to bury me alive. They thought they had perfectly orchestrated a flawless, invisible murder, but they had made one fatal error. They broadcast their criminal blueprint directly into the ear of a man who was now fully awake, fully aware, and brutally prepared to burn their syndicate to the ground tonight. I pressed the small plastic earpiece back into my ear, my hand trembling, not from the chemical sedatives, but from a cold, absolute rage. The initial shock of Dr. Aris had passed, replaced by a crystalline and focused clarity. Down in the dimly lit basement, the sinister conversation was continuing. The heavy, gravelly voice of the syndicate enforcer rumbled through the tiny speaker. He was not entirely satisfied with the complex legal maneuvering. He bluntly stated that courts take time, aggressive lawyers file injunctions, and messy, prolonged legal battles always draw unwanted attention from nosy federal regulators. He fiercely demanded a permanent, immediate guarantee that the house would be entirely clear of any encumbrances, including a living owner, by tomorrow afternoon. Derek replied, his voice exceptionally smooth and sickeningly confident. He assured the enforcer that there would be absolutely no unexpected legal delays because the power of attorney was merely a temporary contingency. I held my breath in the dark. Derek chuckled, a chilling, hollow, soulless sound. He explicitly stated that the psychiatric facility brochure I had found in the kitchen was nothing more than a carefully planted, highly deceptive prop. It was a fabricated cover story, completely designed to satisfy the nosy neighbors and my old colleagues, creating a perfectly plausible narrative of rapid mental decline leading to a tragic institutionalized end. But they had absolutely no intention of ever putting me on a transport van. Derek calmly explained that dead men do not contest property transfers, nor do they occasionally experience moments of clear mental clarity that could alert the authorities. Dr. Aris stepped smoothly into the conversation, adopting the same clinical, detached tone he used when explaining my routine cholesterol results. He opened his leather medical bag, the metallic zipper echoing sharply over the audio feed. He explained that he had recently procured a highly specialized concentrated potassium compound. It was entirely untraceable in standard post-mortem toxicology screenings. Aris meticulously laid out the sequence of events for tomorrow morning. Between 7 and 8 in the morning, when my artificial chemical lethargy was at its absolute peak, Monica would administer the injection directly into my delicate intravenous line. Aris described the physiological reaction with horrifying precision. The compound would immediately flood my circulatory system, causing a massive, catastrophic cardiac arrest. It would perfectly mimic a fatal heart attack brought on by the severe physical stress of advanced rapid-onset dementia. It would be entirely painless, he noted, a small professional mercy that made my stomach aggressively churn. Monica chimed in, her voice dripping with eager anticipation. She confirmed that she had the exact timing memorized and the lethal syringe already prepped in her locked medical kit upstairs. Then Aris delivered the final ironclad guarantee. As my primary care physician of 15 years, he would be the professional called to the scene to officially pronounce the time of death. He would personally sign the death certificate, explicitly listing natural causes due to advanced age and sudden heart failure. There would be absolutely no police investigation, no autopsy, and zero suspicion from the county coroner. It was a perfectly locked loop. Derek let out a long, heavy sigh of immense relief, clearly savoring his impending victory. He boldly outlined the final financial spoils of their monstrous conspiracy. Not only did he securely hold the $2 million from the fraudulent home equity loan, but my sudden demise would immediately trigger my comprehensive life insurance policy. That policy guaranteed a completely untaxed payout of exactly $1 million directly to Derek as my sole listed beneficiary, $3 million and total legal immunity. The enforcer let out a low whistle of genuine impressed approval. He slapped Derek hard on the shoulder, the heavy thud resonating in my ear, and declared that the syndicate would arrive with the heavy transport trucks at exactly noon tomorrow to take full physical possession of the property. The basement door opened and closed as the sinister meeting concluded, leaving my son, his wife, and my corrupted doctor alone with their counterfeit fortune. I pulled the earpiece free and set it gently on the nightstand. The darkness of my bedroom felt incredibly suffocating, pressing in on me with the terrifying weight of my own impending execution. Friday morning. 7 in the morning. I had less than 7 hours to live according to their meticulously crafted timeline. I slowly sat up and swung my legs over the edge of the mattress, planting my bare feet firmly on the hardwood floor. The sheer, unadulterated evil of their coordinated plan had completely eradicated any lingering paternal hesitation within my soul. They were not simply greedy or desperate relatives making poor choices. They were calculated, cold-blooded murderers who had placed a precise, lucrative dollar value on my existence. I reached for my burner phone and opened a highly encrypted messaging application Warren had discreetly installed for emergency silent communication. My thumbs flew across the small digital keyboard with the rapid, flawless precision of an experienced engineer drafting a complex demolition sequence. I typed a long, detailed, and decisive message to Warren. I outlined the untraceable potassium injection, the exact timeline of the planned murder, and the specific, undeniable involvement of Dr. Lawrence Aris in falsifying the death certificate. I clearly explained that the massive criminal syndicate would be arriving at my private residence at exactly noon to claim the estate. I hit send, watching the small delivery confirmation icon instantly appear on the glowing screen. I did not wait for his legal reply. I stood up, feeling a powerful electric surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline flood my veins, completely washing away the last remnants of the chemical lethargy they had forced upon me for weeks. The trap was fully loaded. The digital evidence was absolute, and the arrogant prey downstairs remained completely oblivious to their doom. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. Tomorrow, this quiet neighborhood would know exactly what happens when you attempt to bury an engineer inside his own fortress. I turned back to gather my hidden resources. I retrieved an encrypted hard drive from the hollowed base of a decorative lamp. I transferred the high-resolution photographs of the basement contraband counterfeit plates and forged deeds onto the secure drive. I needed absolute redundancy. If Derek managed to destroy my phone during the impending confrontation, Warren would still possess the irrefutable evidence required to dismantle their lives. I zipped the hard drive into the hidden pocket of my sweater. I moved to my closet and unbuttoned a dark, tailored suit I had not worn since my wife passed away. I laid the fine garments across the armchair, preparing my armor for the morning. I would not face my cruel executioners wearing the pathetic pajamas they foolishly expected. I would confidently greet them with the unyielding dignity and power of the man they had tried to erase. The grandfather clock chimed 3 times. Exactly 4 agonizing hours remained until Monica would walk through my door with a syringe full of poison. I sat on the edge of my bed, perfectly still, perfectly calm, and waited for the sun to rise. As I sat on the edge of my mattress in the dark, my mind demanded certainty. I had transferred the photographic evidence to the encrypted hard drive, but I needed to ensure the audio files had completely synchronized without any corruption. I picked up the burner phone from the nightstand, my fingers tracing the cold casing. I opened the application and navigated to the final audio file recorded just before the syndicate enforcer left the basement. I placed the small earpiece back into my ear and pressed play. The digital timeline rewound to the exact moment the heavy door had opened to let the men out. The recording did not capture immediate silence. It captured a terrifying pause. The enforcer had stopped at the base of the wooden stairwell, his heavy boots grinding against the concrete floor. The ambient hum of the counterfeit printing press thumped steadily in the background, a mechanical heartbeat beneath the tense quiet. I closed my eyes, visualizing the scene through the lens of the hidden micro-cameras I had installed. The massive loan shark turned his broad shoulders, blocking the exit, and looked down at my son. The man was a professional predator, a violent criminal who broke bones and ruined lives for a living. Yet even he seemed momentarily paused by the sheer coldness of the domestic assassination plot. He leaned against the handrail, the timber creaking under his weight. The enforcer let out a rumbling breath that distorted the sensitive microphone hidden in the ventilation duct. He looked at Derek with a wary, evaluating scrutiny. He had spent his entire life operating in a dark underworld where loyalty was enforced by fear and blood was often spilled over debts. But murder, specifically patricide, was a threshold that even hardened criminals recognized as profoundly dark. The enforcer crossed his arms over his chest, the leather of his jacket squeaking softly. He lowered his voice, dropping the threatening cadence he used earlier when demanding the property deed. It became a genuine inquiry from one killer to another. He asked Derek if he was sure he wanted to follow through with this permanent solution. He warned my son that there was no coming back from crossing that specific line. He explicitly stated that taking out an old man to clear a debt was a heavy burden to carry. He wanted to look Derek in the eye and know the weak corporate manager had the stomach to kill his own flesh and blood. The question hung in the stagnant basement air, heavy and suffocating. It was a critical moment of hesitation. It was the final opportunity for my son to display a single ounce of humanity, a shred of moral conflict, or a fleeting shadow of the boy I had lovingly raised. I held my breath in the dark bedroom, my hand gripping the edge of the mattress until my knuckles turned completely white. I waited for a stammer, a nervous justification, or even a hollow rationalization about being trapped by the syndicate. I received absolutely none of those things. Through the earpiece, I heard Derek let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. It was not the sound of a desperate man backed into a corner. It was a cold, arrogant, and entirely remorseless sound. Derek laughed coldly, a chilling vibration that completely stripped away any remaining illusion I held about his character. He looked the violent enforcer dead in the eye and delivered his final verdict on my life. He stated that I had been nothing but a cheap, demanding old fossil his entire life. He complained that I had constantly forced him to earn his way, never simply handing him the wealth he believed he inherently deserved. Derek's voice dripped with absolute venom as he declared that putting me down was not a tragedy, but a profound mercy to himself. He stated with brutal, unflinching clarity that he was completely sick and tired of pretending to be the grateful, dutiful son. He wanted the house, he wanted the massive life insurance payout, and he wanted me permanently erased from his existence. He assured the enforcer that tomorrow morning, the old man would be gone, and the entire property would be theirs to command. The audio file ended, cutting out to a sharp, hissing static before fading into total silence. I reached up and slowly pulled the earpiece from my ear, dropping it onto the wooden nightstand. I sat in the darkness of my bedroom, surrounded by the deep, quiet shadows of the early morning. I did not cry. My eyes were entirely dry, devoid of any moisture or sorrow. I did not feel a sudden crushing wave of grief, nor did my chest heave with the agonizing heartbreak of a parent losing a child to darkness. That profound emotional devastation had already occurred. The father who loved his son unconditionally, the man who had spent 3 decades working tirelessly to build a secure legacy for his family, died at that exact moment. He simply ceased to exist, entirely eradicated by the sheer magnitude of the $2 million betrayal. What remained, sitting in the dark, was something entirely different. I felt my posture shift, my spine straightening into a rigid, unyielding line. My mind cleared of all confusion, sentimentality, and hesitation. I was no longer a victim. I was a highly trained, deeply experienced structural engineer. And I was currently standing inside a structure that possessed a catastrophically faulty foundation. Derek was a deeply flawed, irreparably compromised support beam that threatened to bring the entire building down upon my head. An engineer does not mourn a rotten pillar. He systematically isolates the failure, calculates the necessary demolition charges, and brings the corrupted structure down with absolute mathematical precision. I stood up from the bed, my movements fluid, sharp, and completely devoid of the artificial tremors I had meticulously practiced for weeks. I walked over to the armchair, where my dark, tailored suit lay waiting in the shadows. I ran my hands over the fine wool fabric, feeling the crisp, sharp edges of the lapels. The time for hiding behind the pathetic guise of dementia was officially over. I picked up the burner phone from the nightstand. The screen cast a pale, ghostly light across my face as I opened the encrypted messaging application one final time. I selected Warren Mitchell's secure contact file. I did not need to write a lengthy emotional explanation or provide any further legal justification for the upcoming strike. Warren had heard the audio feeds. He knew exactly what was scheduled to happen at 7 o'clock this morning. I simply typed a single definitive directive. I typed, "Execute Protocol Omega. Bring the FBI." I pressed send, watching the small blue confirmation checkmark appear instantly. I powered down the device and slipped it into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. The digital clock on the dresser glowed a bright red. It was 4 in the morning. I had exactly 3 hours left to wait. I walked to the window, pulling the heavy curtain back just a fraction of an inch to watch the empty suburban street. I was ready to demolish them. The pale, creeping light of early morning finally pierced the gap in the heavy curtains, signaling the arrival of Friday. I stood up from the edge of my mattress, feeling a profound, chilling calmness settle over my entire being. The agonizing hours of waiting had hardened my resolve into an impenetrable sheet of ice. I walked over to the armchair and carefully put on my dark, tailored suit. I buttoned the crisp white shirt, adjusted the silk tie, and slipped my arms into the fine wool jacket. I smoothed the fabric across my chest, feeling the solid weight of the encrypted hard drive secured in the inner pocket. I did not look like a frail, confused old man clinging to the fading fragments of his memory. I looked like the chief structural engineer I had been for 40 years, a man accustomed to commanding multi-million-dollar projects and demanding absolute perfection. I glanced at my watch. It was exactly 6:45 in the morning. The execution protocol was officially commencing. I picked up my burner phone and activated the secure application, tuning into the live audio transmitters I had strategically placed throughout the ventilation system. The digital feed hummed quietly for a moment before the distinct sounds of the kitchen filtered through the tiny earpiece. I heard the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Monica's low heels against the polished tile floor. The heavy refrigerator door opened and closed. Then the heavy front door chimed, indicating the security system had been disarmed from the outside. Heavy footsteps entered the foyer. Derek spoke, his voice hushed and tight with nervous anticipation. He welcomed Dr. Lawrence Aris into my home. The 3 conspirators gathered around the large marble island in the center of the kitchen, positioned directly beneath a primary air duct. I listened with cold, detached precision as my murder was methodically prepared. Dr. Aris set a heavy leather medical bag onto the granite countertop with a dull thud. The metallic zipper rasped loudly as he opened the main compartment. He spoke in a low, clinical tone, completely devoid of any moral hesitation or human empathy. He instructed Monica to bring him a sterile tray and a pair of surgical gloves. I heard the clatter of stainless steel and the snap of latex. Aris calmly explained that he had drawn the exact lethal dosage of the concentrated potassium compound. He warned Monica that the chemical reaction would be instantaneous and catastrophic. He told her she needed to inject the fluid rapidly and smoothly into my intravenous line to ensure my heart stopped before I could register the pain or cry out for help. Monica replied with a steady, eager voice. She confirmed that she had my morning sedatives ready to crush into my water, assuring the doctor that I would be entirely unresponsive before the needle even touched my skin. Derek paced back and forth across the kitchen floor, his leather shoes squeaking against the tile. His voice betrayed a sickening mixture of pure terror and euphoric greed. He asked Aris if he was absolutely certain the coroner would not flag the sudden cardiac arrest as suspicious. Aris chuckled a dry, dismissive sound that made my jaw clench. He confidently reiterated that his pristine medical reputation, combined with the extensively fabricated neurological charts he had already submitted to the state database, provided an impenetrable shield of plausible deniability. He arrogantly promised Derek that by 9 o'clock the death certificate would be officially signed, sealed, and filed. The massive life insurance policy would be triggered, and the violent syndicate arriving at noon would inherit an empty, quiet house. They were completely ready. It was time for me to change the structural parameters of their flawless plan. I turned away from the window and walked out of my bedroom. I moved silently down the carpeted hallway, bypassing the grand staircase that led down to the kitchen. Instead, I turned left and approached the heavy oak double doors of my private home office. This room had always been my absolute sanctuary, a strictly forbidden zone for Derek and Monica, even before they launched their sinister plot. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside, the familiar scent of old paper leather and drafting graphite filling my lungs. The walls were lined with massive floor-to-ceiling bookshelves containing decades of structural blueprints and engineering texts. In the center of the room sat a massive custom-built mahogany desk. I walked behind the heavy desk and took a seat in the high-backed leather chair. I did not turn on the desk lamp. I preferred the dim gray light filtering through the large picture window overlooking the front driveway. When I designed and constructed this house 30 years ago, I built it to withstand the absolute worst forces of nature. Living in a region susceptible to catastrophic weather, I utilized my professional expertise to transform the property into a virtually indestructible fortress. Derek believed he controlled the house because he had changed the security codes on the front door and installed a biometric lock on the basement. He possessed absolutely no comprehension of the true structural capabilities integrated into the walls. I reached underneath the heavy mahogany desk, tracing my fingers along the smooth wooden paneling near the right drawer. I found the small recessed groove and pressed upward. A concealed wooden panel dropped silently into my waiting hand, revealing a small brushed steel control box. In the center of the metal plate rested a single heavy red button, protected by a clear plastic safety cover. Through the earpiece, I heard Monica announce that the lethal syringe was perfectly prepped. Derek told her to go upstairs and finish the job. He told her not to come back down until it was over. I flipped the clear plastic safety cover backward, resting my index finger directly against the cold red plastic. The father who had loved and protected his family was a ghost. Only the architect of their impending destruction remained. I pressed the heavy red button down until it clicked firmly into place, engaging the house's maximum security lockdown protocol. The response was instantaneous and absolutely deafening. A piercing, high-decibel emergency siren erupted simultaneously from hidden speakers in every single room, hallway, and corridor of the massive house. The horrific oscillating wail was designed to disorient and paralyze. Instantly, the house's primary electrical grid deliberately cut out, plunging the entire structure into darkness, save for the blood-red glow of the emergency backup lighting fixtures mounted near the baseboards. Then came the thunderous mechanical roar of the primary defense system. Massive automated steel hurricane shutters, specifically engineered from military-grade, reinforced alloys to withstand the crushing impact of a Category 5 storm, violently slammed down over every single exterior window and door. Through the live audio feed, I heard the immediate chaotic explosion of pure panic inside the kitchen. Monica screamed out, dropping the lethal syringe onto the granite countertop with a sharp clatter. Derek shouted loudly, in absolute confusion, desperately demanding an explanation for the sudden lockdown. Their flawless execution plan was officially cancelled. The precise, merciless demolition sequence had truly begun. The heavy mechanical groans of the steel shutters slamming into their reinforced concrete tracks echoed through the mansion, followed by a profound, suffocating silence. The artificial twilight of the emergency red lighting cast long, sinister shadows across my mahogany desk. Through the thick, bulletproof glass of my home office doors, I watched Derek sprint down the corridor. His perfectly tailored suit jacket flared open as he ran, his face twisted into a mask of absolute, unadulterated panic. He reached the heavy oak double doors and grabbed the brass handles, violently rattling them. When the locking mechanism refused to yield, he began pounding his fists against the reinforced glass center panels. He shouted my name over and over, demanding that I open the door, claiming that the security system had malfunctioned. His voice was completely and entirely muffled by the acoustic dampening of the engineered glass. I sat perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair, my hands resting calmly on the smooth wooden surface of the desk. I watched him throw his shoulder against the wood, desperately trying to leverage his body weight to force an entry. He looked exactly like a trapped animal, finally realizing the walls of his cage were rapidly closing in. I reached out and pressed the sequence of buttons on my desktop communication console. The green indicator light flared to life, connecting my microphone directly to the high-fidelity, multi-room audio system I had installed throughout the entire estate. I leaned forward, bringing my mouth close to the receiver. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the absolute certainty of my victory settle into my vocal cords. When I spoke, my voice resonated through the hidden speakers in the kitchen, the hallways, and the basement. It was not the weak, slurring whisper of a dementia patient. It was deep, steady, and terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of a man who held absolute control over every single variable in the environment. I told Derek to stop damaging the door. My voice echoed through the house, bouncing off the high ceilings and wrapping around the conspirators with inescapable clarity. I told him that I built this house to withstand a Category 5 hurricane. I paused, letting the silence stretch for 3 agonizing seconds. Then I asked him, "Did you really think a couple of greedy rats could chew their way through it?" Through the glass, I saw Derek freeze instantly. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pallid gray in the red emergency light. He slowly backed away from the office doors, his eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying realization. He knew immediately that the game was entirely over. He knew that the frail, oblivious old man he had been eagerly planning to murder was an elaborate tactical fiction. He turned around and slowly walked back toward the kitchen, his steps heavy and entirely defeated. I toggled a switch on the communication console, connecting my burner phone directly into the house's primary audio feed. I opened the encrypted application, selected the audio file I had recorded in the basement just a few hours ago, and pressed play. The chilling, gravelly voice of the syndicate enforcer boomed through the pristine speakers, demanding a permanent guarantee that the house would be clear by tomorrow afternoon. Then Derek's own voice filled the mansion, arrogant and cruel, explicitly confirming that the psychiatric brochure was a backup lie and that dead men do not contest property transfers. I watched the live video feed from the kitchen security camera on my desktop monitor. Monica was standing near the marble island, her hands trembling violently. She was still holding the specialized lethal syringe filled with the untraceable potassium compound. As Dr. Lawrence Aris's voice echoed over the speakers, calmly detailing the exact medical mechanism of the fatal heart attack he had orchestrated, Monica's fingers went completely slack. The syringe slipped from her grasp, tumbling through the air, and shattered against the hard granite countertop. The clear, deadly liquid pooled across the stone surface, dripping harmlessly onto the tile floor. She clapped her hands over her mouth, letting out a muffled, terrified sob, physically backing away from the spilled poison as if it were suddenly burning the counter. Dr. Aris stood perfectly frozen near the stainless steel refrigerator. His meticulously crafted facade of a highly respected medical professional had completely dissolved. His eyes darted wildly around the locked kitchen, searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. The audio recording continued to play, broadcasting his callous guarantee to falsify my death certificate and officially attribute my murder to natural causes. The undeniable recorded proof of his absolute corruption echoed back at him, stripping away his prestigious career, his freedom, and his entire future in a matter of seconds. Panic completely overtook his rational mind. He grabbed a heavy, solid oak dining chair from the breakfast nook, hoisting it above his head with a desperate, primal scream. He charged toward the large kitchen window, swinging the chair with every ounce of physical strength he possessed. The heavy wooden legs smashed violently into the thick glass. The impact was deafening, but the result was entirely futile. The window was lined with an impact-resistant polycarbonate film, and directly behind it sat the solid corrugated steel of the automated hurricane shutter. The heavy oak chair splintered upon impact, snapping into several jagged pieces that rained down onto the floor. Aris stumbled backward, clutching his wrist in obvious pain. He stared at the unyielding window, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The house was an impenetrable vault. They could not break the glass, they could not pry the steel shutters, and they could not bypass the reinforced doors. They were entirely trapped in a steel box of their own making, forced to stand in the red emergency lighting and listen to the recorded evidence of their own murderous conspiracy looping endlessly over the surround sound system. Derek collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table, burying his face in his hands, completely paralyzed by the absolute catastrophic failure of his master plan. I sat back in my leather chair, watching their total psychological collapse on the security monitor. I did not feel any sympathy. I felt only the cold, precise satisfaction of a perfectly executed structural demolition. The house had held firm. The trap had sprung flawlessly. Then the final element of my counteroffensive arrived. Through the tiny angled louvers of the heavy steel shutters covering my office window, I saw the darkness of the street suddenly fracture. Brilliant, rapidly strobing flashes of red and blue light cut through the morning gloom, painting the walls of my study in sharp, chaotic colors. The distant wail of multiple approaching sirens grew exponentially louder, converging directly on my address from every possible direction. The heavy, unmistakable rumble of large tactical vehicles shook the ground beneath the foundation. I heard the screech of tires as several heavy sedans and armored transport trucks violently mounted the curb, forming an impenetrable perimeter around the property. Warren and the FBI had finally arrived, surrounding the property with overwhelming force. My steel trap was now perfectly complete. A tremendous, deafening boom shattered the morning air as the FBI tactical breach team deployed a heavy-shaped charge against the fortified front entrance. My reinforced steel door buckled inward with a violent groan of tearing metal. The heavy locking mechanism fractured completely, sending sharp shrapnel flying across the polished marble floor of the grand foyer. Heavily armed federal agents poured into the house with tactical precision. Their flashlights cut through the dim, red-tinted gloom of the emergency lighting, casting long, chaotic beams across the corridor. Voices boomed with absolute authority, demanding compliance and ordering everyone to drop to the ground. Through my office window, I watched as the tactical units swiftly navigated the hallway, moving with the disciplined coordination of a highly trained strike force. They converged immediately upon the kitchen, drawn by the frantic, terrified screams of my son and his accomplices. The heavy steel hurricane shutters had trapped the conspirators exactly where I wanted them. The agents breached the kitchen threshold, their heavy boots thudding against the imported tile. They swept their tactical rifles across the room, securing the perimeter in a matter of seconds. I watched the security monitor as the imposing federal presence completely overwhelmed the three-cornered criminals. They had spent weeks carefully planning a silent assassination, relying entirely on deception and the quiet cover of suburban normalcy. Now they were brutally exposed under the harsh glare of a full-scale federal raid. The sudden reality of their situation hit them with the crushing weight of a collapsing concrete pillar. They were cornered rats, trapped in the cage they prepared for me. Derek collapsed onto his knees. His suit jacket bunched awkwardly around his shoulders as he threw his hands into the air, surrendering with pathetic, trembling speed. He looked absolutely terrified, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. Monica was in an entirely different state of psychological freefall. She backed away from the federal agents, her hands raised defensively, shaking her head in violent denial. She pointed a trembling finger directly at her husband, screaming hysterically over the chaotic noise of the tactical raid. She frantically told the armed agents she had nothing to do with the criminal syndicate or the counterfeit operation. She sobbed uncontrollably, insisting that Derek had manipulated her, forcing her into participating in the assassination plot against her will. Derek spun around on his knees, his jaw dropping in sheer disbelief at his wife's instantaneous betrayal. He opened his mouth to argue, but the commanding shout of a senior FBI agent immediately silenced him. Dr. Aris stood frozen against the stainless steel refrigerator, his hands raised high above his head. The shattered pieces of the heavy oak chair lay scattered around his expensive leather shoes. He looked completely hollowed out, staring blankly at the federal agents with the dull, vacant expression of a man who suddenly realizes his entire prestigious career and personal freedom have been permanently eradicated. The tactical team swiftly moved in, forcing all three conspirators firmly onto the cold tile floor. The harsh metallic ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the kitchen sounded like a perfectly tuned symphony to my ears. I reached under my heavy mahogany desk and pushed the secondary release button, smoothly lifting the interior security lockdown on my private office doors. I stood up from my leather chair, adjusting the cuffs of my crisp white shirt and smoothing my tailored suit jacket. I walked confidently across the room, my posture perfectly straight. I opened the double doors and stepped out into the chaotic red-lit corridor. The scent of burnt explosive powder hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile environment Derek tried to maintain. I walked slowly toward the kitchen, my polished, hard leather shoes clicking sharply against the floorboards. As I entered the room, the senior tactical officer recognized me from the briefing files and respectfully stepped aside, allowing me to approach the center of the kitchen. Derek was kneeling on the floor, his hands securely bound behind his back. When he heard my footsteps, he slowly raised his head. His eyes were wide red and completely brimming with desperate, pathetic tears. He stared at my sharp, tailored suit and my unyielding expression, finally comprehending the devastating magnitude of his own massive miscalculation. He began to sob, openly begging me for mercy. He cried out that he was my only son, that we were blood, and that families should always forgive one another. He pleaded with me to tell the federal agents that this was all a terrible, tragic misunderstanding. I stopped directly in front of him, looking down at his trembling form. The absolute clarity of my engineered logic left absolutely no room for paternal weakness. I looked directly into his desperate, pleading eyes and delivered my final, uncompromising judgment. "You called me a clueless old man," I said, my voice steady, deep, and resonating with absolute finality. "But an old man knows that you never build your future on a stolen foundation." Derek squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a long, agonizing wail of pure despair as the undeniable truth of my words finally crushed his spirit. The federal agents hauled him roughly to his feet, marching him toward the shattered front entrance. Monica followed closely behind, still sobbing hysterically, and blaming everyone but herself for the lethal syringe resting on the counter. Dr. Aris was the last to be escorted out, his head bowed in profound shame as he walked past the shattered remnants of his professional dignity. I stood quietly in my kitchen and watched the flashing lights carry my enemies away into the dark morning. The subsequent legal aftermath was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. Warren Mitchell orchestrated a flawless legal campaign, utilizing the massive cache of photographic evidence, financial records, and crystal-clear audio recordings I had painstakingly gathered. Facing the overwhelming reality of the syndicate's counterfeit operation and the undeniable audio of their premeditated murder plot, the conspirators' highly paid defense attorneys aggressively pushed for rapid plea deals. there would be absolutely no leniency. Derek Monica and Dr. Lawrence Aris were each formally convicted of massive federal wire fraud, extensive money laundering, and premeditated conspiracy to commit murder. The federal judge, thoroughly disgusted by the sheer cruelty of their domestic betrayal, handed down severe, unyielding sentences. They were each condemned to serve 30 agonizing years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I legally reclaimed absolute, uncontested control over my entire estate, utilizing Warren's sharp expertise to systematically dismantle every fraudulent document Derek had filed. I officially signed over the illicit basement operation to federal authorities. With my properties entirely and legally secured, I immediately sold the massive suburban fortress. I relocated to the beautiful warm coast of Florida, purchasing a stunning condominium overlooking the vibrant blue ocean. I sit on my balcony today, breathing the fresh, salty ocean air. I hold a crystal glass of neat bourbon, listening to the gentle crashing of the waves. I am surrounded by a small, loyal circle of genuine friends who value my wisdom. I successfully demolished a corrupted foundation, and in its place I meticulously engineered a truly indestructible peace. Never ever mistake a person's kindness, age, or silence for weakness. Blood may make you relatives, but it is loyalty, respect, and absolute integrity that make you family. When greed poisons the hearts of those you trust, they will justify the most unthinkable betrayals just to take what you've built. You cannot change a parasite's nature, but you can choose to stop feeding it. Protect your legacy, guard your hard-earned assets, and always remember, true strength isn't about avoiding the storm, but having the architectural wisdom to lock the doors and let the traitors drown in the rain they created. Did this story shock you? Have you ever experienced a deep betrayal from someone you trusted completely? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more thrilling real-life stories. See you next time.